How do you change the culture in an organization beyond diversity, equity, and inclusion to one where people feel like they really belong? This is what this episode's guest will talk about. Hi, my name is Ingo Rau. Welcome to the School of Becoming, where together with a team of advisors and supporters, as well as Manage Magazine, we curated a program around activating inclusion. Today's guest is Lorne Rubis. Lorne has more than 40 years experience in leading large organizations as a CEO through cultural as well as transformational changes. Recently, he became the founder of Belongify, an organization devoted to support large organizations in creating cultures of belonging. In this presentation, Lorne will share with us a framework that can help you create cultures of belonging. Welcome, Lorne.
Before you leave today, I'd love to have kind of placed in front of you perhaps a way of thinking about how to build and create this culture of belonging. What kind of a system or framework might you consider to guide you in conversations with those around you as we create this culture of belonging, which is, I think, so deeply important. Okay, I'm going to jump in, and now while I have this presentation, of course, the most important thing is the conversation, and Ingo's going to help by jumping on the chat and as we go through this. And I just want to maybe just frame this up by just referring to a belonging initiative that was launched by the president of Harvard University. So it was From Diversity to Belonging. They launched it last year. And Dean David Hempton from the Faculty of Divinity, actually, as he kind of did a bit of a preface on the executive summary of that particular work that they began. There are a number of quotes from his newsletter that just struck me. One is that it is such a powerful word that it just resonates so much with self-acceptance, with community, a sense of home, of being where we're meant to be, where we can flourish individually and corporately. There's something deeply ethical about it that, and of course, it's a beautiful word and it's a word we're striving for. And you can read that, but these, this sort of summary of his thinking on it really struck me. And a little bit more about who I am. My work has mostly been, as Ingo mentioned, over the 40 years, has been really around transformational change from a cultural perspective. Prior to advising the post-secondary institution that I'm advising now, plus a couple of organizations, I got my hands right in the middle of this as the chief people officer and then chief evangelist of a financial institution in Canada, 5,000 people, $50 billion of assets, 85-year-old institution. And when I got there, the engagement scores had dropped to 69%. And with a phenomenal team around me, the C-suite, all my colleagues, when we concluded, our engagement score was 92%. Our customer satisfaction scores were the highest we'd ever had, amongst the highest in the industry. Our financial performance was at an all-time high. And so it was just an opportunity to think about, how did we do that? How did we really create that? And so building on my 40 plus years of being in a variety of organizations, including working directly for the chair of a Fortune 50 company, where I was one of 7 direct reports to him. I was the VP of operations, Los Angeles Kings Hockey Club for a while, CEO of a NASDAQ traded technology company. And I had my own company for decades, and now starting again a startup around, with, as Ingo said, around Belongify. And it's not to just point out that that everything that I'm talking about around sort of driving, advancing culture, I've been involved in, I've tried, And I put it to work myself, and I try to back it up with as much data and science as possible. And I'm applying the same thinking as I can to Belongify. So if you want to find out more about that, there's lots of ways to find me on social. But the one thing that I just wanted to just maybe invite you to park at for a minute is, how did you personally feel, or how do you feel when you feel like you don't belong? Like, if you just take a moment to just think about that, and even, pick a word or two that you feel comfortable just dropping into the chat. How did you feel, or how do you feel when you don't belong? What's that feel like? And we probably all had those experiences.
Yeah, so we have a couple of comments here. Angela says, like an alien. Diksha said, low on morale. Lara said, really sad. Oriana said, disconnected. Aaron says, alone. We also have that couple of other comments, like lonely, excluded, feeling like wasting time, probably my own and the one of others. Anna said, awful, unwelcome, non-contributor.
Yeah.
Small.
Yeah, and then of course, on the other side, and of course, I'm just jumping on this more recent experience around the Seattle storm here in this picture, which is, how do you feel when you belong? How do you feel when you really belong? What are those feelings like?
So we have respected, energized, thriving. I can be myself. Like we are achieving things together, cared for, feels like equal, empowered, powerful, at my best, right where I need to be, feels like home.
Yeah, feels like home. And here's the incredible sort of paradox of it. It's that hard and that easy, right? In some ways, it's like we obviously want to turn down the amount of times we feel like the former and turn up these feelings of belonging. And what is really striking me is that this decade in front of us here, there's going to be this tremendous momentum of this adding an attention to belonging. And it's and I really want to emphasize that this conversation, this series, has been so important around all these elements. And I really took Lisa and Tina's work and try to build on it, maybe took a little bit of liberty with it. But the interesting thing, and I want to quote, there's a woman by the name of Jackie Parchment, who's the CEO of Mercer Canada. Mercer is one of the larger organizations in Canada. She's the only Black CEO, woman CEO of a top 50 company in Canada. She's also director of Black North for the Black North Institute. And she just wrote not too long ago an article in Canada's Globe and Mail, which would be similar to our version of the New York Times or the Post, something in that regard. But we need to, and she quotes, we need to shift our thinking from a focus on D&I alone and start cultivating a more deeply rooted sense of belonging in the workplace. And this is also kind of supported by some recent work at Harvard. It's one of the reasons why I think the president of the company launched this committee around moving from diversity to belonging. And Deloitte's Global 2020 study, which reinforced that how much belonging is evolving as a theme that requires some additional consideration. And we know a little and a lot. Some people know a lot, but for most of us in the corporate or nonprofit world, even, that we're still learning around how to put this into the mix. So, according to Tina and Lisa, and maybe they might even be on and they can maybe clarify this if I don't get it quite right. And because this is every one of these conversations and elements are vital. So diversity is sort of just it's the mix, right? It's the facts and data. You and most of you are experts on this around, and of course, there's been so much more attention on the social justice side, appropriately so, unfairness in the mix. And inclusion is, and particularly, I love the work on nudging around the behavioral side about applying the mix. And then there's this sense of the outcome of that, the emotional outcome of feeling deeply valued and feeling so much a contributor in the mix. And so my argument is that we need to be working on all these together. And I'm going to do my best, everything in my heart and soul, to add whatever I might, building on the great work of so many others, to build this community and movement of belonging and to focus on that part. And I really appreciate you joining me for that journey. And the definitions around this are quite important too. And this really got me thinking. And again, this is a little bit out of the work that the Harvard committee did, and Dean Hempton from Harvard Divinity School. And frankly, and I haven't really pulled on a lot of the work out of places like divinity colleges or anything. So, but more in this, it's interesting that angle is bringing a perspective as well. And his comment is that we need to give sense about, remember, there's an ethical part of belonging. And why I think that's so vital is that this ties into our deeper cultural initiatives around the importance of purpose. And I even think on the School of Becoming, you go from check to purpose, and this notion of the deep need for a purpose. And so belonging and having a deeply compelling purpose are vital. They go together. There's also this self-accountability in belonging. And the idea is that if we don't accept ourselves and know ourselves and feel that we can find ourselves, then we're never really, doesn't matter what happens around the conditions of belonging. We may not be doing our part. We may never feel like we fully belong. So we've got a role to play from an internal perspective. And of course, there's this sense of justice belonging where in the community we're in, we feel that everybody's respected, and that on the other side, there's a sense that it's not acceptable to diminish. And then there's this universal belonging, and it depends, this goes on the psychological and social science theory of this around just our human need to belong. And then there's sort of almost a collective belonging, primitive belonging around. It's just, we look out for one another. It's for our care and feeding and so these belonging definitions all exist. And I try to connect with them as I talk about creating this system of belonging. Now, for quants and others that want the data that, and there's way more than this. I'm just going to highlight a couple of pieces and I'm referring to, again, Deloitte's work, Harvard's work, a number of studies, but generally, if you look at these numbers, not surprisingly, that there's, if we feel like we belong, we contribute and produce more in the best sense of that word. And when we feel like we don't, we either consciously or subconsciously pull back. We can't or don't. And you can, put whatever spotlight you want on any one of these. But generally, again, and that leaders are starting to get this, wait a minute. While we need to have our eye on what's happening in diversity and social justice and inclusion and how that's playing out through the culture itself, and that's vital. What's happening at the individual level in teams, what's happened is vital as well. And that there's something deeply important around belonging. So how might we work on all those streams in some integrated, balanced kind of a way? And so when I went to look at some of the drivers I'm pulling some of these out of a couple of different places, but these seem to be minimum conditions, and they kind of tie into some of the other definitions, right? Or belonging. So that these drivers need to exist to some extent. The fairness and equity piece. There's lots about being able to bring our authentic selves to work. There's this sense of community and team connection, alignment to values and purpose, individual contribution. There's a whole study around how much appreciation and recognition is vital, and the leadership system itself. I mean, so as always, the formal leadership system, the people that have the privilege of being able to direct and create conditions for people to thrive through the way they organize design work and have technology and money applied and resources, or have to be vitally prepared to provide conditions. So the leadership system and our peers matter. The idea of the power of how our peers, so we have an individual accountability, leaders do, but we do with the people on the left and right and in front and around us do as well. And then this whole notion of self-awareness and self-accountability. So there's some element of these drivers that play out in all the studies. So this is my shot after spending considerable time when someone asks me, how might we, and I love the phrase, how might we create a culture of belonging? So I try and connect that with my overall culture framework, and thinking about how to create a thriving culture overall, and sort of build a sub-narrative around that fits into that overall framework and system. And these are the 10 elements that somehow need to be connected. Now, I'm going to talk about 10, and that's a lot, obviously, but my argument is that they're all necessary to some extent. They may not be sufficient, but they're all necessary. So if you're kind of, and Ingel's going to put a poll out in a minute, but I just want to challenge you on this as you're sitting in the spot that you are and you're observing the institutions that you're deeply involved in one way or another. To what extent is there this truly compelling purpose? And I'm not talking, and I'll dig a little bit more into that in a minute, but it needs to be something that people spring up and want to, and drives them to want to contribute. So it goes beyond actually what their team is doing itself, but it's how all the work from individual contribution to team contribution is connected to an overall institution compelling purpose. And then values have been around forever, will always be around. And of course, we've seen them on so many walls, and all of our work most of us try to get them off the walls to exist in between the walls, because they always have good intention on the walls. It's what's happening in between the walls. But then how intentional and what are we really doing to really create story around those values that really gives guidance to people so that they can see, feel, and do. And then, of course, there does need to be an intentional diversity, inclusion, and social equity system that runs in parallel. Now, as we start to get a little bit more granular, I want you to think about intentional welcoming. So the data that we've run into that we're finding is that the system, if you're going to build a culture of belonging, intentional welcome needs to go way beyond what we often see as some orientation in organizations. That is vital. That is vital. But there's something way more important around putting direct intentionality. And now the next one, number 5, is a challenge to all my brothers and sisters out there. And I was only a chief people officer for about 7 years. And before that, I was a CEO of a couple of companies, et cetera, in C-suite positions. But I came to really appreciate at a much deeper level how important and vital this role was. But one of the roles that I think we've not done very well in the HR community is dignified leaving. So my argument is that in order to make belonging work and really reach some level of potential we're more satisfied with, we need to find a way for dignified leaving. And I'm not talking about, except for egregious situations, I guess, which frankly don't happen very often. I'm talking about changing the paradigm around walking people out of the buildings. And then on the personal connection side, there's this notion of the whole idea at a much deeper level around thinking about how do we provide for people to connect at a deeply personal level without it getting invasive or creepy or some kind of additional consideration. But connection needs to take on a deeper meaning than and more intentionality, I believe. I'm going to put some more argument that there's a whole body of work, Amy Edmondson's work out of Harvard, plus other people about psychological safety. And the beauty of this belonging work is that it plays right into the world of Edmondson's and other people's work. Project Aristotle at Google, for those who are familiar with it, around psychological safety. And then what's the leadership system, as I mentioned? What is it? And, when I talk about building great cultures, I talk about have a great, not perfect leadership system. What are the minimal conditions for leaders to create conditions for belonging? What skills must they see and feel and do and act? And how intentional are we around providing and equipping leaders to create those conditions? And then storytelling and collaboration, celebration, excuse me. This idea of the power of story, but also the power of appreciation. And then finally, acute, unrivaled listening. It's curious that Harvard is doing these regular pulse surveys on belonging, and that's just the tip of this iceberg around being able to have a sense of acute listening. So my argument, all 10 of these have to be in play if you really are serious about a culture of belonging. And the great news about it is that they all contribute to a thriving culture overall. And then my other argument is that they start to work together in a connected kind of way. That's the beauty of systems and moving complex systems. It's not so much around just going to root cause, it's creating conditions or a movement so that you create momentum, and many of these reinforce each other. Now we're going to stop there, and I'm going to dig a little bit more into all of them. But in the meantime, Ingo has a poll that he's going to run out and just get you to have a quick reaction to. And then maybe we should just open up to some reactions or comments before I go on too, Ingo.
Yes, perfect. There was a lot of activity in the chat, and if you haven't checked it out yet, feel free to do so. And Lorne, I will read some of the comments out to you, and I'm curious to hear your responses. In the meantime, some of you are already taking the poll. So the question is, which of these building blocks that you see right now in the slide that Lorne shared, do you find the most challenging in your organization, if you're an organization right now? If not, maybe based on your past experience or overall. So as you can see now on your screen, we have compelling purpose is 1% says it's lacking, is the most challenging. We have 14% for people saying diversity, inclusion, and social equity systems. We have 3 people on intentional well-being. Dignified learning is 2. Personal connection. Nobody said that this was a challenge, which probably speaks for you and for your immediate surrounding. Psychological safety, nevertheless, is 5 people said that might be a challenge in the organization or in the context that I was thinking. A leadership system has actually the most votes. So here 10 people said that this is the building block that they find the most challenging. And 4 people said that acute listening is actually a challenge to that. Lorne, what do you think of these results?
Yeah, well, I'm not surprised that the leadership system gets most attention, and it's fundamental also, obviously, to creating a great culture overall. And so, of course, it would make sense that it would also tie into creating a culture of belonging. And I can see why psychological safety would also be there, because it's so much connected as that next sub-layer underneath this leadership system. So, yeah, I'm gonna as I go through. I'm going to go through all 10 just a wee bit deeper, Ingo, and then it might help you think about a little bit more. They might change their numbers a little bit more, but probably not too much. And so, Ingo, I'm going to just carry on then. So I want to talk about compelling purpose for a minute. Look, this is not a new topic. The end with this, though, is that I'm not so sure how great of a job organizations do with this. And CEOs in particular can get very frustrated because they often think this is like telling their Marcom people they ought to go interview a bunch of people, and then some group gets together, puts it down on paper. It may even be around for years, so it gets refreshed, and then can't we just email it out and everybody get it? And the work that's being done by really thoughtful organizations these days is that this has got to be something that has a personal emotional connection with people. And I'm not holding this up as one, great intended to be one shining example. It's one example. This was a better part of 6 months of work at this post-secondary that I've been advising on. And I won't get into all the details around, but we spent a better part of a year really doing the work on this at every level in the organization to create it, to engage the board, and then to engage the whole governance system, board of governors, and the rest of the institution. And we spent the entire months of May and June on Zoom meetings, taking 1,000 people through what these words really meant and how they personally and emotionally connected to each and every single person in the institution, and how might we translate that into the action that would really make this purpose more true. And of course, that's vital to be able to create an extraordinary culture. My argument, it's also vital when you go and you connect it to the definition of belonging. Even though belonging does have has a place right here in this particular purpose statement, that evolved that the importance, though, is that to really create conditions of belonging as well as a great culture overall, this has to be a personal emotional connection to it. It cannot be something that just is somewhere hanging around in the background. It's a fundamental part of the operating system of an institution, and almost on a daily basis, people need to wake up and think about, as much as they do their work. That's vital. But the work and a job can often be a transaction. It's about how to make the purpose more true and how they feel personally connected to that. So I'm just putting an argument for, as at some level, this is intellectually very easy to embrace, but at an operational level, quite challenging to really make really deeply meaningful. And I want to make the same argument around supportive values. I mean, probably many of us have a gag reflex sometime to almost seeing values hanging around because, they've been the water cooler talk virtually and reality for often skepticism and in the worst case, cynicism, because we see a disconnect between oftentimes well-intended stated values and what's really happening in the organization. And so we're not perfect institutions because we're made up of imperfect human beings. But my argument is that somehow your values really need to kind of to be understood and to also be by their nature, reinforce conditions for a great culture, and my argument for conditions for coming to belonging. And if you take, these are examples out of the financial institution that happen to be called ATB, is the name of the institution. Our values were called the ATBs. There's a narrative behind each one of these, but you can see how trust and expect the same from others, or being personally and fiercely accountable. And the one most directly, of course, was this idea of courageously being yourself and a true ally for each other. And the narrative that you have around what drives your working together on a day-to-day basis, the behaviors that are deeply understood, and the recognition system reinforces, and the storytelling behind has to be quite beyond what oftentimes are the glib words that represent values that people place inside annual reports, or they're part of the employee orientation. Dave Mode, who was the CEO of this company, and I, every new hire that came to the organization, we spent one full day. We would bring them in one month at a time. All the new hires of that month, usually 70 to 100 people. And the CEO and I, and with the executives also contributing, all we did was spend time on our purpose and our values, and how to connect and to have anybody, whether they were a customer facing person or a back end support person, to how they would connect personally to these particular values. So my argument is that if you want to create a culture of belonging, then this alignment with the values that you put huge intentionality behind need to be there to reinforce creating conditions where people feel like they really belong, that they really feel at home, and they can bring their true authentic self. And the belonging definitions that seem to be emerging are around this whole idea of really connecting and really contributing, and really feeling a sense of contribution. So as you continue to go down each of these slides, I don't need to be telling you about this. I mean, this is what this whole conversation is about. My argument is that these C systems need to evolve as an and, with all the intentionality, and that all the work that's being done on diversity and inclusion, and now social equity, needs to continue with as much energy as possible. The interesting thing is, when I worked for the chair of a Fortune 50 company, as I mentioned, in 1990, we had a major diversity initiative. We had 50,000 people. All people went through some form of, quote, diversity training, and inclusion wasn't being talked about very much at that time. But that's, we've been at this for a long time, and we need to continue and to get better at it. And my argument is not sufficient. The idea of intentional welcoming, again, is that, and it's kind of why Ingo kind of started the question around, when you bring someone to your home and you really wanted to make them feel welcome, what would you do? So when you think about the people that come into your organization, and then now with all the restructuring that's moving on and all the remote working that's happening, what is the intentionality that's put behind welcoming? And so the data that I've been looking at is that the more that the welcoming is absolutely put with authentic imperative behind, and you actually give thought to how to bring people on, to have them included and involved, and therefore a more rapid approach to belonging, that this needs considerable consideration. So it needs to happen at the cultural level, where you do your kind of onboarding and your cultural work. It needs to happen at the team level. And the end is that what is the actual way? So when you think about when you left and moved to another team or an organization, how have you been welcomed? What's happened? And what could you do to really change that experience in a much to accelerate that? And what kind of impact would it have? And oftentimes when you ask people about this, they will say, well, it took me about 4 or 5, 6 months, sometime often longer, before I really felt like I was welcomed. Like I had to find my own way. It was kind of like that was, here's your job, and we'll make sure you've got you can get on the system. Now go to work. And my argument is that this requires a whole deeper level of thinking and application. And that needs to be expected by leaders, created by leaders, and peers have a role to play in that as well. And there needs to be intentional welcoming at all kinds of places and intersection institutions, not just the first day on the job, but every time you make a major move to join a different group. Now,
can I quickly,
yes.
Since we have a couple of questions here in the chat and we have about 14 minutes left,
yeah,
I want to make sure that we make the most of the time with you, as we only have an hour with you. Hence, I wondered, there have been 2 topics that, or I would say, there was one question around dignified leaving in the chat. If there's anything else that we can do than walking people out. We also have psychological safety and leadership system. And I wondered if we could focus on those 3 and then open up, because there has been a quite interesting question regarding how do you make belonging work when we all work remote, and a couple of other questions. So if it's okay with you, focus on 3, and then we jump into a conversation.
Yeah, it might be 2 hours before I get back to number 10. But and thank you for that. So I want to talk about dignified leaving for a minute and go right, and then come back. So one of the things that was interesting, a story I heard the other day about a pizza company, a local pizza company. I can't even remember where. And on the pizza box, they have the name of every single person that's worked in that company and that pizza place before. So they oftentimes, many local pizza places, oftentimes the employees are there for part-time periods, small journeys in their life, sometimes longer. And they go on to do other things, obviously, school, and then they finish school and they leave. But it's interesting is that many of these workers come back and actually contribute, and they just go and work part-time for fun sometimes, just to help out, just because they're part of that community. And so I'm just using that as a bit of a maybe a trite metaphor in some ways, but think about how we've left organizations. Like, leaving is going to happen more often. So do you want, and again, I'm taking egregious examples off the table, but when we're going to move people out all the time, because restructuring is just a never-ending process. So, for example, at the financial institution, when people leave, how do you want them to leave? Like, don't we want people to leave to say that their time in that organization and to belong there at that time, during that time they felt like they belonged in such a great way? And even though it may seem counterintuitive, that when you are being asked to leave, which unfortunately is happening way more often now for just the nature of the turbulence of marketplaces and the world we live in, my argument is, what if we could make leaving where you feel you have some sense of belonging and attachment left to the institution or the group that you're part of? How might we do that? As opposed to kind of being caught maybe into traps of, what the IT and legal and HR people say that we need to do to, quote, have a risk-free move or a termination. And I just think we're missing out there, and there's something really important about belonging and being more thoughtful about dignified leaving. Now, on the welcoming side, it's the same idea. It's around what would happen if there was literally this welcoming process that when you came, that you received like as if, do you ever have that feeling when we did used to fly, which feels like centuries ago right now? Do you know what that feeling was like when you showed up at the airport and the plane came up to the gate and no one was there? It was like as if, didn't they know we were coming? And I know I'm oversimplifying it, but I think sometime back to this welcoming notion, we're missing out on huge opportunities to accelerate the sense of I'm connected, that I really, and I really feel that I can contribute. So I'm going to stop there, and then we'll go to these other topics, Engel, before we kind of go to maybe more of a close.
Perfect. Thank you.
Any other reaction or comments on those, or and I'm kind of, and hopefully I'm being a bit provocative here on this as well.
Yes. Any thoughts on how we can make these things work? How we can make people feel like they belong in these times of distancing? With that, back to you, Lorne.
Yeah. So when I talked about the purpose statement at the post-secondary institution, I showed it, and that we spent the entire months of May and June connecting the entire institution. We did all of it on Zoom, every bit of it. We haven't been in that institution, unfortunately, since March. And so every process that we've thought about as we're out remotely, there are actually, if we just open up the possibilities, there are so many ways then we can create these conditions by just taking advantage of the technology that is available. I mean, in some ways, it's the same principle. So welcoming, so how might we then welcome when we know, like how people that are being hired right now, what is the welcoming process? When we can't see them, we can't bring them on, we can't bring them over to their work area. So, but many of those elements, if we are put thought behind them, I think we can bring into the, and companies like GitLab, they're companies that do nothing but work remote. There are huge learnings out there if we just allow ourselves to explore how do these companies that have always from the beginning been remote create these tremendous cultures. What have they done? So I just challenge you to go dig into some of those examples. And Zoom is doing the very same thing, actually. Ingo, as we kind of go to, there was a comment about spending a little bit of time on psychological safety, and then
yes, we have about 7 minutes left, and I wonder, because it came up a couple of times, if the time would be well spent talking about leadership systems, because that was the topic that most people voted they felt like was lacking. And we had some comments in chat asking, okay, what does the Belongify leadership system look like? And if you could go there next, that would be amazing.
Yeah, so I think that at the end of the day, at the highest level, leaders need to get meaningful results for sure. The other outcome is that there needs to be evidence that people need to want to work with. So there needs to be a lineup. It's almost the line at the door. So to what extent would you recommend that leader to someone you deeply cared about? You say, yeah, I really would. That's somebody I would go work for. And the other outcome is to what extent do these leaders really develop others? To what extent do you feel like what's the evidence that those leaders have done that? So underneath that, there are some basic practices, because leadership is a practice that leaders need to have. And at minimum, they need to be able to create this compelling purpose and the direction, obviously. And they need to make sure that people are clear about their expectations of contributing to that. And that to be phenomenal coaches, they have to be able to both ask for feedback, give feedback, and then create these opportunities for to be this continuing learning to happen. And they have to be very good at the practice of recognizing and celebrating. So those are practices. Underneath that, these values, and you can really dig into the work of people like Brene Brown and other kind of people. There's an additional attention to around. You've got to have this ability to be compassionate and deeply authentic. And leaders need to practice and to know how to do that, they need to see and feel and do that. And the organization's development work needs to be able to create and invest in that so leaders can do those. So that's the way I define a great but not perfect leadership system that is there to drive belonging. And leaders need to know that they need to find conditions for people to be comfortable, that they can bring their authentic self, that they can feel connected to the purpose and to what the expectations are, highly aligned, and then contribute like heck and to be celebrated and recognized for it. And they've got to have they need to be given actually nudges and reinforcement, and that needs to be demonstrated from the top of the organization all the way down. So that's a lot. That's a whole body of work in itself. But as I say, these elements are connected as a system. You need to work on all of the 10 at the same time. Contrary to what they tell you in MBA school, you got to pick all 3 or whatever. And that doesn't mean that you're not focused. It just means that it's a complex system. You and each other, and you start to move about belonging. Be very intentional about the fact that people, not only in a highly diverse, inclusive, social, with social equity system, but one where at the end of it, people feel like they are absolutely comfortable and welcomed. They're connected, and they can fully contribute. And it makes a hell of a difference when you and I wake up in the morning and we do feel like we belong and we contribute. I mean, in some ways, it's just so intuitively obvious, and it's so damn hard to do and easy to turn off. So anything else that you kind of please push back. Maybe I just want to just say all these, by the way, personal connection. If you don't know the names of the people that work around you, who the people important in their lives are, you don't know if they have where they show up, what they like to do. Again, without being invasive, how can you say you have personal connections? Lots of work on psychological safety. We talked about the leadership system. Tina and Lisa talked a lot about the importance of storytelling. We know celebration, again, acute listening. It's why Harvard's actually out there doing these ongoing pulse surveys. We need to do a lot more listening around where we really are and belonging in all these areas. It's a system. Start the system, create a movement. And one little commercial for us is that we're working at this. We're working with real organizations and real customers on this. We're trying to find ways to do this and scale it in ways that can make a contribution to, or make an impact on belonging, and connect belonging and contribution to productivity. And we think when we can make that happen, and we're using machine learning and some AI to help us with that as we apply these behavioral nudges, we think it can make a difference to organizations and their overall culture and their overall diversity, inclusion, and social justice system. So there's a little bit of a commercial. It's a beautiful word. It's worth striving for. And I believe, or I agree with Dr. Hampton. It should be who we are.
Thank you for listening to this episode. If you like this, please give us a thumbs up. Also, if you want to know about upcoming episodes, check out our program at theschoolofbecoming.org. You can attend any of our live sessions for free, interact with the speakers, as well as other people who are interested in the subject. I'm looking forward to welcome you to one of our future sessions.